We've known who the Texans are going to play for a while now, but now we know when they're playing them. So even though it's early, why don't we go through each game one by one and see how many games we think the Texans are going to win this season?
To throw the punches on. He floats one wide open, and there he goes. Touchdown! For a Texan touchdown.
Before we go through each of the Texans games, I'd like to point out that the most exciting part about the schedule is the amount of games the Texans have that don't take place at noon on Sunday. Texans fans felt like they did enough to put the league on notice to give them some primetime games this season, and they did. Starting week 1, the Texans will be in Indianapolis in the division playing the Colts, and the thing that concerns me about this game is mainly the fact that the top run defense in the league has given up a lot of run yards to this team. And so Jonathan Taylor, Anthony Richardson, you name it about the Colts, that's probably what concerns me. Shane Steichen, to his credit, is a great offensive mind. Now, typically speaking, I tend to give a split in the division. So I think just going based off last year, the Texans will likely win this one in Indianapolis. And then I'd hope they could win at home. But as far as the away game goes, I'm going to give them the win there. Week 2, the Texans are in prime time against the Bears on Sunday Night Football. CJ Stroud versus Caleb Williams, the Lovie Smith legacy game, whatever you want to call it, it's happening, and it's a prime time game very early in the season against a team that the Texans already played in the Hall of Fame game. So what do we think about it? Well, everyone's touting the Bears receiving core and the fact that Caleb Williams is a generational prospect, depending on where you are on that spectrum. But for me, I like this matchup early in the season because it gives the Texans an opportunity to test them before they've established their chemistry as a team. With that, I don't think the Bears are going to be as bad as they were last year, but I think the Texans catching them early gives them high odds of winning this matchup. So I'm also going to give the Texans the edge in this one. Next, the Texans will travel to Minnesota. You can call it the Jonathan Grenard and Blake Cashman revenge game. You can call it the Danielle Hunter revenge game, whatever you want to call it. Don't call it something to be too concerned about. Now, obviously, Kevin O'Connell is a great offensive mind, but depending on which quarterback the Texans get, I think that the defense should be able to take care of itself. It's really going to be a matter of if the Texans treat this the way that they should, which I trust they will. They've never shown to be a team to sleep on an opponent. They prep the way they do. But looking back at last year, even with that mentality, there was some games where they probably should have won and they didn't. And that was what I think made the difference between being like a 12-win team versus a 10-win team last year. So I'm hoping they've figured out how to beat teams that they should beat, because if that's the case, this should be a win. Week 4, the Jaguars come to town to play the Texans. And like I said earlier, in divisional games, I generally tend to give a split. In this one, I really like the Texans better at home. Both games last year were either heavily in the Texans' favor or very close to being a Texans win, particularly the home game, which I was at, that they didn't win. But I think I've been very vocal about thinking the Jaguars are a bit overrated in areas. The new look receiving core doesn't give me as much concern as it could in the future. I really do like Brian Thomas Jr. But overall, I see the Texans being able to take care of business early in the season, getting off to a 4-0 start. Week 5, the Texans are going to be debuting their H-Town uniforms. At least that's what you would think based off of the theme of the game. They'll be playing the Bills. And now with this matchup, it's going to be a clear deciding factor of if Stephon Diggs is the receiver that made Josh Allen, or if Josh Allen's really good and Stephon Diggs is also really good and just a tool that he used. There's a number of different ways that could go, but it is the Stephon Diggs revenge game. And with that, I think that the step back that the receiving core has taken for the Bills will play a factor. A lot of it depends, like I said, on those factors as to whether or not Josh Allen really is that guy, or if Stephon Diggs maybe played a heavier hand in it than maybe we thought he did. And so with that, I think the Texans can win this, and I will give them the win here. I just think that the Bills fighting the cap might have a little trouble, like last season, finding their stride early on. And so once again, another matchup where the Texans meeting the Bills early will play in their favor. So I'm at 5-0 right now. Week 6, the Texans travel to Foxborough. And if there was ever a better time to do it based off of the Texans' history in cold weather, it is this early in the season. Even with as bad as some people feel the Patriots are going to be, that defense still has a lot of its pieces there. Drake May doesn't, or Jacoby Brissett, depending on who they have in at the time, doesn't really scare me. But yeah, it's ideal that this is early in the season. And as you may have guessed, I think the Texans can win this matchup, which would put them at 6-0 on the season. A lot of their easier matchups and a lot of their winnable games happen earlier. The schedule strength got a little tougher, but that doesn't really show itself evident until a little later in the season. Now, week 7 is where the Texans schedule takes a turn. I would say that this is the point where outside of their matchups with the Titans, they realistically could stand to lose any of these matchups. They're just going to be really difficult. But week 7, they will be at Lambeau, which once again is a matchup that, with weather being a factor, is ideal to happen earlier in the season. I like the CJ Stroud versus Jordan Love matchup. It'll be the first time they meet. I think it'll be a good measuring stick for who's where and what. And we'll know a lot more about this Texans team at that point. Right now, I feel strongly that they could win it. I don't think the Packers receiving core is as good as people think it is. I think it might more lie with Jordan Love there, but I'm going to go ahead and barely give this one to the Texans, because I feel like there's other matchups that are more difficult down the line that the Texans might concede. So I'm going to give this one to the Texans. Week 8, the Texans play the Colts at home. I've already spoken about my concerns with this matchup. And as I said, I'm generally going to give a split to the division, regardless of how tough or easy the matchup is. So week 8, I'll chalk up as the Texans' first loss. I didn't want it to be that way. I don't want the Colts to have that to hold over the Texans' head, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. And so with that, the Texans will fall to 7-1. And we'll go into week 9 against the Jets. The real question with this matchup against the Jets is, how are the conditions going to be on that field? I think it's criminal that the schedulers could send CJ Stroud to MetLife twice in a row in back-to-back seasons. And then can the offensive line that the Jets have put together this season keep Aaron Rodgers on the field? So if Aaron Rodgers is there, I think it's a tougher matchup. And if the weather's bad, it's especially a tougher matchup. Assuming that the weather's good and Aaron Rodgers is there. Even so, I probably still give a slight edge to the Jets. I just feel like this is one of those matchups where it's going to be like, CJ Stroud could go in there and really prove something as a young gun, and then Rodgers just puts on an old person masterclass, just a seasoned veteran quarterback performance that maybe is far better than he's done all season. And it's important that happens. Then I think it'll force the Texans as a team to evaluate their secondary, which I've said so far this season is one of their bigger weaknesses going into the season, even still with what they've done this offseason. So with that, the Texans would fall to 7-2. In week 10, the Texans play the Lions. I think this is the Super Bowl preview. This is probably my favorite matchup on the entire schedule. The Texans will go there for Sunday Night Football. It's a primetime game. It's going to be a big deal. I think the Texans could take this matchup. There's a lot to be said about which quarterback is better. Based on what I've said, I would reckon that CJ is probably the better quarterback between him and Goff at this point in the season. So with that in mind, this is the kind of matchup where you tip your hat towards the better quarterback. And so I'd say the Texans edge out a win in week 10 against the Lions, and they climb up to 8-2. Week 11 is another matchup that I really like. It's another primetime game, Monday Night Football, against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, depending on who you ask, this is probably most people's favorite game of the season. It's always a good season when the Texans get to play their in-state rivals, the Cowboys. And depending on which side of that rivalry you're on, it could be a stronger or weaker rivalry, all things considered. But with this recent push where a lot of the national media is pushing the Texans as the best team in Texas, there's going to be a lot going on around this matchup. There should be at this point in the season. I think the Texans go into Dallas and they take care of business. I do think it's a close game, but I think the Texans push to 9-2. I think that the fall off happens a little later. I don't think the Texans win too many more games the rest of the season. But at this point, I'm still on the Texans are going to win here. I think CJ has a far better showing than Dak. I expect Dak to kind of fold. So yeah, next up is the Titans. I would say the Texans win this matchup to get to 10 games. maybe at this point in the season, I'll have seen something from Will Levis that makes me believe the Titans are better than some people think they are. If you think that Texans fans are sleeping on the Titans, I am the poster child of sleeping on the Titans. I am dead asleep, and there is no waking me up outside of Will Levis just being as good as he has potential to be in this season to this point. So I just don't see the Texans losing to the Titans at home. In week 13, the Texans play the Jaguars. We once again already talked about this. This is the second time up, and based off of my rule, this will be the loss. The Texans will fall to the Jaguars here. That'll put them at 10-3 going into the bye week, which I think is pretty solid positioning. And it honestly almost appears to be a little better than what I've spoken to now that I'm looking at the schedule as to how I think the Texans are going to do. And yeah, I mean, there's not much else to say about it. The Texans 10-3 going into the bye week. It's a good thing the bye week is week 14 because weeks 15 through 17 is the toughest stretch the Texans will face this entire season. So it depends really on how the Dolphins do, and that's the next matchup. In week 15, the Dolphins will be coming to Houston, and I have trouble believing Mike McDaniel has the fall off that some people seem to think he's going to. The Dolphins are a team much like the Bills that are fighting the cap, but I think they're still in much better shape than the Bills. And so I think, especially it being in Houston, that environment is conducive to the Dolphins because it's not both the Texans and the Dolphins don't necessarily do well in cold, bad weather. So there's no clear advantage there. I think just once again, this one's a matchup where you go down to quarterback, and I like CJ over Tua. If Tua is even healthy for this matchup. So I'm going to give this one to the Texans. They'll be at 11-3 going into the gauntlet. Doing pretty well to start it. Week 16, the Texans go to Arrowhead. This is going to be a cold weather matchup. It's not going to be fun. As much as I want to say the Texans could win here, this is one where, once again, kind of like with Aaron Rodgers earlier in the season, I just feel like this is a matchup where the GOAT, Patrick Mahomes, is who I have to go with here. I mean, I got to think that Xavier Worthy is going to show enough, even with Rashee Rice probably maybe out, maybe back, who knows? But I mean, him and Travis Kelce are probably enough for the Chiefs to make this. It's going to be close. They're not going to throttle the Texans, but I mean, it'll be a rough game, and I think the Chiefs come out on top. In week 17, the Texans play the Ravens at home. This is ideal. I think it's their first opportunity to show that they can beat the Ravens as in their current iteration. I like the Texans' chances. If I'm being optimistic, this is optimistic me, and I'm saying we're at home. You know, the Texans have a strong run defense. They've fixed their issues in coverage. I have trouble not taking them over the Ravens here based on that. Based on history, it should be the Ravens, but I think that the Texans at home, this is their last win of the season. Based off rule, the next week is the Titans, and I will give the Texans a loss in week 18 to the Titans because of how I plot the division. They'll go 3-3 in the division in my mind, regardless of how much I don't think they should lose to the Titans. So I think they win on Christmas Day, give us the gift of showing they can contend in the AFC, splitting the series between the Ravens and the Chiefs in those back-to-back weeks, I think is a blessing. And so with that, the Texans finish out at 12-5, which I think is solid. I don't think it's number one seed record like some people think. There's people already projecting the Texans as a 1 seed, but I think that the Texans hold their own. They come out in a good spot. Ideally, they win more of these games that I said they would lose and come out with the 1 seed because I'm going to go ahead and say it. I mean, I've already hypothesized based off their history on the road in the playoffs that the way this team makes it to the Super Bowl and potentially wins it is by being the 1 seed and having home field advantage. If they're playing in NRG the entire playoffs, that place is going to be the loudest place you've ever heard. It'll get louder every round. And yeah, I just think that that's the way. In the words of Mando, this is the way. What do y'all think? What do y'all think of my record prediction? How do y'all think the Texans are going to do? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for listening to this bullpen bit on the Texans schedule win prediction, or what you listened to the video, you know what we talked about. I have been James Roy. You can find me on social media at M1 Texans fan or James Roy NFL, depending on which social media. I should really streamline that so that's easier to say, but oh well. As I've said on previous episodes, I'm a Fanatics affiliate now. The second that I reach enough money from those links and stuff to buy 2 jerseys, I will be doing a giveaway on Instagram and Twitter, separate giveaways of a jersey of your choosing when that happens. So if you're thinking about buying anything from Fanatics, maybe you should check the link in my bio on all social media and you'll find my affiliate link. If you buy it through that link, then you will be helping get a giveaway so that y'all can get a jersey. As always, stay classy, Houston, and Vamos Texans. Thanks for tuning into The Bullpen, a Texans podcast, part of the Fans First Sports Network. Please like, comment, subscribe, and follow along for more Texans talk from The Bullpen.
Pick the handoff. Stroud